Oh, hello and welcome. Welcome to the endocrine system. Okay, so I'm just trying. I know you've probably had a long day, and I'm just trying to, keep things in. Anyway, welcome to physiology. Boy, the screen looks awfully dark. That's fine. I just ate a granola bar, so I don't want to spit granola at the screen. Let's get started. All right. Well, welcome. I hope you're all doing well. I realize you won't see this probably for another day or so, but welcome. We're going to talk today about the endocrine system. And I thought I would begin by kind of a real case. When people learn that you are a veterinary technician, they are going to ask you all sorts of questions. They're probably already asking you about their animals. Let's say someone comes to you with their little pony here, who lately has been looking kind of weird. Okay, this kind of strange, shaggy appearance. So there's something involving his skin and hair growth, but also other systems are involved. He's polydipsic and polyuric. So what's weird? I mean, what possible part of the body would cause so many different problems, and coming on kind of gradually for that matter? Well, of course, it would have to be the endocrine system. Um, um, this system is in control along with your nervous system. Your nervous system and your endocrine system are how different parts of the body talk to each other. Now, the nervous system is fast, 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 fast. It boggles the mind. It takes in information and it sends out orders fast. So does the endocrine system. Um, but these organs that are dancing around here, they are much more slow. The messages they send out are more subtle. So we'll see all these guys later. Way off to the far left is your thymus gland. But anyway, we'll see all these guys in a little bit. What we'll do is I'd like you to pause right now, and there's on Canvas are your notes, the student notes. So go through the 10 questions at the end of the student notes. Sorry, I forgot to put the subtitles on there. Um, the Go through the 10 questions at the end, and then come back and resume watching. So I'll just wait a few minutes. Okay, you're all done? Let's continue. Now, as fascinating as the endocrine system is, that's not why we care. We care because you will see all sorts of endocrine problems, some actual disorders like this or this. This little cat looks like he's on methamphetamines. Or this dog with the tragic expression. But most dogs with hypothyroidism are not this obvious looking. Hormones show up in various products. There are growth hormones that can be used in cows. And you'll see on your milk, it will usually say this product was not made from cows treated with a growth hormone. This is the growth hormone right here. Hormones will show up in, you'll see when you're working with patients that are pregnant or about to give birth, or patients that need to produce milk, you'll realize that oxytocin is a very important hormone. We don't want to screw up or interfere with the action of oxytocin. And you'll see that there are cases where one hormone will interfere with another hormone. We'll learn what gestational diabetes is. We'll also learn what regular diabetes is. Regular diabetes would be diabetes mellitus. There's also diabetes insipidus. And then there's gestational diabetes, which is a form of diabetes mellitus. So we'll talk about all this. Our goals will be to describe the endocrine glands that are shown in this horse or in you, the pituitary, the thyroid, the parathyroid glands. We'll talk about all of these. We'll also talk about the hypothalamus a little bit. It's not shown here. We'll learn about negative and positive feedback systems, and we'll describe the hormones and hormone-like substances that are produced. The hormone-like substances are produced by the kidneys and stomach and other organs. So as we said, you've got these two systems, the endocrine system and the nervous system, working together to allow different parts of your body to communicate. Right down here, these are little hormones traveling along, and they're going to have some effect on that target cell. And over here you have your nervous system, right? Fast, fast, fast. Over here is the endocrine system, slow, slow, slow. In fact, I'm just going to occasionally stop and refer to my notes here. Okay. The way that one is fast and one is slow, it's helpful to think of how they work. In the case of the endocrine system, this little table breaks it all down for you. Its target would be just about any cell in the body. There are certain hormones that affect every single cell. In the nervous system, the cells that are the target would be glandular tissue or cells in muscle tissue, right? So it's not every single tissue in the body. The nervous system doesn't really do anything to the liver, for example. It doesn't really do anything to the spleen. It just does things to skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, things like that. The chemical messenger would be a hormone. In the endocrine system, it's going to travel very far. It could travel from your pituitary gland all the way down to your adrenal gland. Cortisone from the adrenal gland, well, that's going to affect brain cells, skin cells, muscle cells, all over the body. And it lasts a long time. Whereas nervous system, they're just traveling from the neuron to whatever the target is, and it's a very short distance that the neurotransmitter is going to travel. And these two systems interact. We talked about if you get into a car accident, well, you have this immediate fight or flight reaction, but even an hour later, your knees are shaking and your heart's racing and you just may feel kind of lightheaded. Well, that's not your nervous system anymore. Your nervous system worked fast in the moment of the car wreck, but the nervous system stimulated the adrenal gland to release epinephrine, which is a hormone. And now that hormone is still working. Its effects are much slower, and that's why even an hour later, you still feel this adrenaline rush, or whatever you want to call it. The same sort of thing can happen with the with when a baby cries. You may know women will tell you that when they heard their baby cry, they began to produce milk and it leaked through their shirt. Um, the nervous system is hearing their crying baby or somebody's crying baby, and then that stimulates the hormone oxytocin to cause milk to be let down. So again, these are examples of these two systems working together. We need to make sure we understand when we say glands, there's two different kinds of glands. And today we're talking about endocrine glands, which means that these are glands that produce hormones, and these hormones are being released into the bloodstream. There's no little opening, they just get secreted into the bloodstream. You have other glands with names like salivary glands, oil glands, sweat glands. Those are called exocrine glands because they secrete through ducts onto some sort of a surface. And sometimes the skin, but even sometimes internally. And we'll learn more about that when we learn about the digestive system and the integumentary system. So what is a hormone? All right. You can see here is some sort of a gland, some sort of an endocrine gland producing a hormone. It gets secreted into the bloodstream. It may travel a long distance until it reaches different target cells where it, in this case, it's binding to a receptor on that cell's surface. It's important to remember that this is a very broad term. We say hormone, it's like saying vegetable or fruit. This is a very broad term. They're very, very different hormones. They can be very many different chemicals that are all hormones. Some are steroids, some are peptides, some are amines, some are enzymes. You learned how the kidney makes this hormone called renin. Renin is a hormone and an enzyme. So it's a very broad term. Even steroid is a broad term. There are many kinds of steroids, and we will talk about catabolic versus anabolic steroids. Finally, there are these other hormone-like chemicals that we'll talk about. In particular, prostaglandins. They cause changes like a hormone, but they're not exactly hormones. So let's start by looking at the big three categories. Again, there's steroids like cortisone, aldosterone, progesterone, testosterone, and estrogen. We'll talk a little more about them. We won't say much more about these names, but just so you know, peptides, wherever I put my little face, peptides tend to be these chains of amino acids. So there's insulin, right? Rather long chain of amino acids. Oxytocin, antidiuretic hormone, those are all examples of peptides. So they can be quite large. And then we have these very small hormones that are the monoamines. So they're just made out of a few amino acids. Epinephrine is a monoamine. The thyroid hormone, thyroxine, is also a monoamine, so quite tiny. Now, why do we care? Why is that important? Well, it'll help you to understand problems. All hormones work by stimulating a receptor, right? We said. I'm just gonna hide myself. Okay. Well, sometimes I like to make a gesture. So I'm not sure where to go. I'll go over here now. Peptides are not lipid soluble, okay? They cannot diffuse across the cell membrane. So there's the cell membrane. So these little red dots here would be examples of peptides. Again, peptides are hormones like insulin, oxytocin, right? They are going to work on the surface of the cell. But steroids are lipid soluble. They can dissolve across this lipid membrane of cells, and they actually stimulate receptors that are inside the cell. Okay, why is that important? Like I said earlier, you're going to see cases of where steroid hormones are interfering with peptide hormones. And that'll help you to explain or even prevent gestational diabetes. Why does stress interfere with the ability to give birth or to lactate? For example, you have an animal that's about to give birth. If all of the owners are stressing out this poor animal, that animal may not go into labor very effectively. When we are trying to work with milk cows or milking goats, we don't want a noisy, chaotic, abusive relationship with them. We don't want people yelling and screaming at dairy cows. Maybe Caroline can, mention something in the discussion about this. So, because it interferes with oxytocin. So we'll talk more about that, and we'll also learn how the steroid hormone glucocorticoids can carry certain risks. Anyway, that's why it's important. It'll help you understand why certain hormones can interfere with other hormones. But let's just say a little more about the steroid hormones. There are so many of them. Again, there's testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. Those are the sex hormones. There's cortisone. That's the main glucocorticoid. There's aldosterone. All of these are steroids, and they all have these 4 rings because they are all made out of cholesterol. And you can see cholesterol has these same 4 rings, and that's where every steroid hormone is made. Cholesterol is the building block for all of these other types of hormones. We said that some steroid hormones are anabolic. That means they build up muscle. And other steroids are catabolic, meaning they break down muscle. And we'll talk more about that. And you'll hear this word anabolic for another hormone, even though it's not a steroid. So other hormones can be anabolic, not just steroids. And something we're going to see, especially when we talk about the thyroid hormone and as well as cortisone, we're going to talk about negative feedback. So if you understand negative feedback, you'll understand how we diagnose things like thyroid disease and hyperadrenocorticism and hypoadrenocorticism. But mostly it'll help you understand how we diagnose thyroid, low thyroid disorders, and hyperadrenocorticism. So the example that's always used is this: the thermostat on the heater in your house. So if your house is cold and you turn the thermostat up to 75 degrees, then the heater kicks on, and let's follow along right here. So you turn on the here we go. We turn on the heater, and the thermostat is set to, here they put 20 degrees Celsius. I don't even know what that is. But let's say it's pretty warm. The temperature in the room increases, and then that feeds back to the thermostat and tells the thermostat, you can turn off now. Or if the temperature, I guess, were to go too high, let's say, then that will tell the thermostat, stop and turn off until the room decreases. In other words, there's this negative feedback to the thermostat. When the room has reached the right temperature, that information feeds back to the thermostat negatively. It doesn't tell the thermostat to make things hotter. It tells the thermostat to turn off. But you'll see that again in part 2 when we talk a little more about the thyroid hormone. There are 2 other types of feedback. We'll talk more about positive feedback in the reproductive system. This is an example where instead of when a hormone level reaches a certain point, instead of telling the body to stop and make less or to stop making any more, here's the opposite. When the hormone reaches a certain point, it tells another part of the body to make more and more and more. And that's actually what happens. You're looking here at an ovary, and that's a follicle, and the follicle just burst and released an egg. And what's happening there is estrogen is being released from another part of the ovary, and it's actually stimulating the production of a hormone called luteinizing hormone, or LH. So, but we'll talk more about that next week. The other kind of feedback, to me, is not even really feedback. It's what we talked about during the car wreck. It's just the nervous system can stimulate, for example, the adrenal gland to release hormones like epinephrine. Again, I don't know why that's called feedback. It's not really feedback. It's just another way that the body can cause the release of certain hormones. In this case, the hormones are the catecholamines, or what I should say is it's catecholamines in the sympathetic nervous system, like norepinephrine, which is causing these hormones to be released. And again, you're right. Look at that. There's norepinephrine. It's also a hormone. So what are the major glands? Here they are, and we're going to talk about each of them and some of the problems we encounter as we go along here. So we're going to start by talking about the hypothalamus. So here we are. This is in your brain, a part of the brain that we will call the diencephalon. I don't care if you know that. That's just the name of that part of the brain. There's this little stalk here called the hypothalamus, which then leads to these 2 little lobes, the anterior and posterior pituitary lobe. But let's start by talking about the hypothalamus. It's a link between the nervous system and the endocrine system, or a bridge, whatever you want to call it. It itself has some important nervous system functions involving body temperature and regulation. Body temperature regulation and the nervous system. Oh my gosh, what is wrong with me? Appetite, the wake-sleep cycle. There's other parts of the body that are involved with that too. But the way the book describes it is the hypothalamus links your conscious mind to your lower brain and your endocrine system. Oh my gosh, I cannot win. We don't care that much about the hormones that the hypothalamus makes. There's not very many diseases associated with them. In fact, I can't think of any, but we do see a lot of diseases involved with the hormones of this part of the body, the pituitary gland. So let's talk about that. It is important to note that the hypothalamus does produce two hormones that are actually stored and released by the posterior lobe, but in general, we think of them as being made by the posterior pituitary lobe. That's how you'll always hear it referred to. So we want to talk about the pituitary gland itself. Probably well known as the master gland because it makes so many hormones involved with so many things. And we're going to talk about each of these hormones here, as well as some problems that we encounter. I'm just going to, sorry. Okay. So first we'll talk about the anterior pituitary gland. Now it's really important to be aware that these two glands are totally different. The posterior pituitary gland and the anterior pituitary gland are, they have different embryonic origins. They have totally different structures, totally different functions. They are not just two parts of the same gland. I don't know how they ended up side by side. So first we'll talk about the anterior pituitary gland. And this is a mistake. It says we learned about LH and FSH last week. Let me tell you a little story. In the past, we used to talk about the reproductive system first, and then we would talk about the endocrine system. There's a chicken and the egg problem with these two systems because it's hard to talk about the endocrine system unless you've talked about the reproductive system, but it's hard to talk about the reproductive system unless you talked about the endocrine system. And I realized this year I really need to talk about the endocrine system first. So there are a few parts in this talk where, you know, I need to mention certain things, but we're going to learn about it more next week when we learn about the reproductive system. I'm just going to leave my little face up there. So the first hormone we'll talk about is a growth hormone. Now it's obvious from the name what it does. It's an anabolic hormone, so it builds up muscle, it builds up bone. It's really important in young animals. It's responsible for growth. But even now in you're still making growth hormone. It plays a role in metabolism of proteins and carbohydrates and fats. But the book is a little confusing. It goes into a lot of detail, and we don't really care about all of that detail. We do care that there are some problems that it can cause. So, well, this is not a problem, but this is a growth hormone that is sometimes used in dairy cows. So growth hormones can also be called somatotropin. And this word tropin means to have some sort of a stimulatory effect on a target organ. And so somatotropin, somata means body. So somatotropin means this has some sort of a stimulatory effect on the body. And that's just another word for growth hormone. RBST stands for I don't remember. B stands for bovine. ST stands for somatotropin. And they probably chose the word somatotropin because growth hormone just sounds kind of unnatural. But that's what RBST is. It's a growth hormone. used in dairy cattle. I personally hate this product, but don't get me started on that. There are actual diseases we see in animals. So this little German Shepherd on the right here has a deficiency of growth hormone. And so he is, you'll hear the term pituitary dwarfism. The opposite problem can also occur. This dog in the middle has excessive growth hormone. For some reason, his pituitary gland is producing too much growth hormone, and this condition is called acromegaly, just kind of this just kind of unusually large face and head with these large features. And this gentleman, you probably know him as Andre the Giant. He played Fezzik in the Pituitary Bride, the Princess Bride. I like that, the Pituitary Bride. Anyway, he had an excess of growth hormone, and unfortunately, that's part of why he died pretty young. I forget, I think it had other effects on other parts of his body. Another hormone is the thyroid stimulating hormone. Its job is pretty self-explanatory. It's released from the anterior pituitary, and it stimulates the thyroid gland to make more thyroid hormone. And so if thyroid hormone levels are low, the body will produce more TSH to stimulate production of thyroid hormone. Now there's two strange errors in the chapter. So if you have your book handy, I just want you to make these changes. In the fourth sentence in this section, it reads, if the activity is increased by falling levels of the hormone, the feedback is said to be positive feedback. Well, no, it's not. That's not the definition of positive feedback. This is a description of negative feedback. When rising or falling levels of a hormone, I should say, when rising levels have a negative effect, or if falling levels of the hormone increase the release of another hormone, that's negative feedback. Well, it is negative feedback. The better way to think of negative feedback would be if the activity is decreased by increasing levels of the hormone. Anyway, now I feel I've just made it more complicated. So just cross that out in the book. The other mistake is in the section entitled Thyroid Stimulating Hormone. The sentence reads, increased TSH secretion increases thyroid hormone production and vice versa. Cross out and vice versa. The statement is correct except for and vice versa. Increased thyroid hormone production will decrease TSH. And that's what we're talking about. That's negative feedback. Another hormone, fairly simple to understand, is called adrenocorticotropin hormone. And for short, we just call it ACTH. So its job, you can tell from the name. Again, tropin means has a stimulating effect on a target organ. And what is the target organ? It's the adrenal cortex. So adrenocorticotropin. Again, cortex means sort of the outer layer. Adreno refers to the adrenal gland. And this part here is the medulla. That's where epinephrine and norepinephrine are made. this cortex is where glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids are made. FSH and LH are also made in the anterior pituitary gland. These are involved with the reproductive cycle in women, although they play a role in men too. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and as the name suggests, it stimulates the growth and development of follicles. That's what you're seeing right here. There's an ovary. There's this little bubble with an egg inside. That's the follicle. And you'll see the follicle is going to ovulate. Well, it wants to ovulate, but right now, follicle stimulating hormone is just causing the cells of that follicle to develop and grow, and it's also stimulating the follicle to produce another hormone called estrogen. You'll learn more about estrogens next week. They're responsible for all the physical and behavioral changes that prepare females for breeding and pregnancy. In males, FSH actually stimulates sperm production, so it plays a role there too. LH stands for luteinizing hormone, and it completes this process of follicle development. The estrogen that's produced by the follicle will feed back to the anterior pituitary. It has a negative feedback effect on FSH. So as estrogen levels go up, FSH levels will go down. But the estrogen also has a positive feedback effect on luteinizing hormone. And so as estrogen levels go up, so do luteinizing hormones. And as the luteinizing hormones get higher and higher, we get this surge of luteinizing hormone, and that's what causes the egg to be ovulated. It causes the follicle to burst and let the egg fly out. Then that empty follicle turns into something called the corpus luteum, also known as the yellow body. And you'll see it mentioned a lot next week. But the corpus luteum makes progesterone. Progesterone stands for progestation. Progesterone is the hormone that maintains pregnancy. And the corpus luteum makes progesterone. We'll mention the corpus luteum a few more times later today. What effect does LH have in men? It stimulates the interstitial cells of the testes to produce testosterone. So I think that's pretty cool. We get these hormones that do, they're found in males and females, and they do different things. And then I think the final hormone produced by the anterior pituitary gland is called prolactin. And so just from the name, you should be able to tell that it's responsible for milk production. So it's going to stimulate the production of milk in mammary tissue. This other hormone we'll talk about called oxytocin actually helps squeeze the milk out. And so we'll talk about that when we talk about oxytocin. So here's this other part of the pituitary gland called the posterior pituitary, and it makes two hormones, oxytocin and ADH. Like we mentioned, technically these hormones are made by the hypothalamus, and they're stored and released in the posterior pituitary. So you may remember we talked about antidiuretic hormone before. This is the hormone that its job is to cause reabsorption of water. It communicates to the nephrons to reabsorb more water, and that helps prevent dehydration. And we talked about how caffeine and alcohol will inhibit the release of ADH. So that will make your urine contain more water. There's also this kind of diabetes called diabetes insipidus. It's sometimes called water diabetes. This is totally different from sweet diabetes, also known as diabetes mellitus. Diabetes insipidus is a problem with ADH. If in animals, it's usually due to some sort of trauma. A dog or cat gets hit by a car, or they're in the car when the car gets in a car accident, and somehow they traumatize the back of their head, some sort of blunt trauma, and suddenly over the next month, these dogs and cats are highly polyuric and polydipsic. And the reason is because they've developed diabetes insipidus. And then the last hormone, again, produced by the posterior pituitary, is oxytocin. You may know it as Pitocin. That's what it's called in human hospitals. And it's got two jobs. One is during birth, it's going to stimulate contractions of smooth muscle in the uterus, and that's going to help the mom to help expel her baby. It also plays a role during breeding. It'll help actually carry sperm into the uterus. And oxytocin, we also mentioned, helps the mammary glands produce milk. Oxytocin helps the mammary glands to let down the milk. And I just mentioned this. Mammary glands are glands, but they're really, what do you think? Are they endocrine or exocrine glands? Well, these would be exocrine glands because the milk travels through these little ducts and it can travel sort of outside the body. What happens is milk develops in these little structures called alveoli, same name as in alveoli in the lungs. And they're surrounded by this kind of unique tissue called myoepithelial cells, and they act a little bit like smooth muscle. And so oxytocin can act on these myoepithelial cells and cause them to squeeze, and that will allow milk to be released. I mention all this because you will see in real life that oxytocin can be antagonized by stress, cortisol, catecholamines. They will interfere with oxytocin's ability to allow milk to be released. All right, that's the end of part one. Now, rather than me, giving you this boring little review, what I would like you to do is to stop, go to Canvas, and there is a Quizlet there. Now, I wish you could all play it together. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you can find a way, but certainly it'll be a chance to just sort of stop and review what we've learned so far. So do that, and then join me for part two.